There are names in history that echo like thunder: Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon. But among them stands one man Rome never truly forgot. A commander so bold, so relentless, that generations of Roman mothers were said to quiet their children with a single warning. Hannibal is at the gates. He crossed mountains that should have killed him. He led elephants into lands that had never seen them. He shattered Roman armies again and again, not with luck, but with vision, nerve, and an almost terrifying understanding of war. And yet, for all his brilliance, Hannibal did not destroy Rome. So who was he, really? The greatest enemy Rome ever faced? A military genius centuries ahead of his time? Or the tragic architect of a victory he could never quite reach? This is the story of Hannibal Barca, the man who came closer than almost anyone to breaking the Roman world. Hannibal Barca was not born into peace, nor into a world that allowed great men the luxury of innocence. He entered history in 247 BC in Carthage, a city of staggering wealth, restless ambition, and bitter memory. Carthage was no crude kingdom of raiders or desert chieftains. It was one of the most sophisticated powers of the ancient Mediterranean, rich from trade, commanding at sea, tied to markets and ports across North Africa, Iberia, and beyond. Its merchants dealt in silver, grain, timber, ivory, dyes, and war itself. Its harbors were crowded, its coffers deep, its influence vast. Yet for all that splendor, there was something raw beneath the surface when Hannibal was born. Carthage had been wounded. Rome had seen to that. The First Punic War had dragged on for years, a colossal contest between two rising powers that could not comfortably share the same world. In the end, Carthage had lost. The defeat was not simply territorial or financial, it was psychological. Rome had broken Carthaginian confidence and shown that even a maritime giant could be humbled by a harder, more relentless opponent. The wound did not heal, it hardened. In that bitterness, Hannibal's life began. His father, Hannibal Barca, was one of the defining figures of that age, fierce, disciplined, and utterly unwilling to accept that Rome's victory was the final word. He was not the sort of man to yield to decline. Instead, he turned to Iberia, where silver, manpower, and fresh military opportunity offered Carthage a path back to strength. According to ancient tradition, before taking his son with him, Hamilcar brought the young Hannibal to an altar and made him swear an oath that he would never be a friend to Rome. Whether the scene occurred exactly as later writers described it is almost beside the point. Its symbolic truth is too powerful to ignore. Hannibal was raised not merely to dislike Rome, but to understand it as the defining adversary of his civilization, his family, and perhaps his destiny. Hatred alone does not make greatness. But when hatred is fused with discipline, intelligence, and purpose, it can shape a life into something formidable. In Iberia, Hannibal grew into command the hard way, not in marble halls, not in abstract philosophy, but in camps, marches, sieges, and negotiations with tribal leaders whose loyalty could shift with the wind. He learned war as a living thing, not merely the clash of armies, but the movement of supply, the management of fear, the reading of terrain, the weighing of men. He saw how power was built at the frontier, where empires were not inherited intact, but assembled through risk, force, and endurance. When Hamilcar died, the family project did not die with him. Leadership passed to Hasdrubal the Fair, who expanded Carthaginian influence through a mix of diplomacy and military strength. Then, when Hasdrubal was assassinated, command passed to Hannibal. He was still young by the standards of history's giants, but the army accepted him. That matters. Armies do not follow youth out of politeness. They follow men who radiate certainty, men who look as though they belong at the center of events. Even then, Hannibal must have possessed that rare command presence that cannot be taught and cannot be faked for long. he quickly proved equal to the role. He campaigned with speed, intelligence, and force, consolidating Carthaginian power in Iberia and building a war machine that drew on Africans, Iberians, cavalry, infantry, and the hard lessons of frontier command. But the road to his legend did not begin with a grand speech or a ceremonial title. It began, as so often in history, with a city that became more than a city. Saguntum. Saguntum stood south of the river Ebro, within what Carthage regarded as its sphere of influence, yet it aligned itself with Rome. That made it more than a local problem. It made it a provocation. Hannibal understood perfectly what was at stake. To leave it alone would be to accept Roman encroachment. To strike it was to challenge Rome directly. He chose the second path. The siege was hard, deliberate, and politically explosive. Rome protested. Hannibal continued. When Saguntum finally fell in 219 BC, diplomacy effectively collapsed with it. Rome demanded Hannibal's surrender. Carthage refused. The Second Punic War began not as a misunderstanding, but as the consequence of two powers that had long ceased to believe coexistence was possible. At that moment, many in the Mediterranean would have expected a familiar war fleets, raids, fighting in Sicily, perhaps campaigns in Spain or Africa. Hannibal had no intention of giving Rome a familiar war. He was already thinking on a scale that bordered on the unbelievable. He did not merely want to defeat Roman forces. He wanted to shake Roman confidence at its core. He wanted to carry the war into Italy itself. And to do that, he would choose a road so dangerous that even the idea of it sounded like madness. To understand why Hannibal became a legend, one must begin not with Cannae, but with the decision that made Cannae possible. Great commanders do not simply win battles. They reshape the field upon which history expects battle to occur. In 218 BC, Hannibal did exactly that. Rather than challenge Roman naval strength head-on or fight the war on terms his enemies understood, he chose a plan so audacious that it still feels cinematic more than 2,000 years later. He would march from Iberia, through Gaul, across the Alps, and descend into Italy from the north. This was not daring for its own sake. It was strategic imagination of the highest order. Rome expected threats to come by sea or from conventional theaters of war. Hannibal intended to appear where he would be least expected and most psychologically devastating. He wanted not only military access to Italy, but surprise so profound that it would crack Roman certainty before the main struggle had even begun. His army was vast and diverse, assembled from the many peoples under Carthaginian influence: Libyans, Iberians, cavalrymen of remarkable skill, hardened infantry, and the animals that would become inseparable from his legend, elephants. Even now, the image has power. An army from the western Mediterranean, carrying war elephants, climbing into mountain passes, thought impassable for such a force, advancing towards the heart of Rome's world. It is the kind of vision that transforms history into myth. But in reality, the march was no myth. It was misery on a monumental scale. Gaul was unstable ground. Tribes could be bargained with, intimidated, or temporarily allied, but none of that guaranteed safety. Supplies had to be secured, bridges crossed, rivers navigated, morale preserved. Every mile demanded energy, calculation, and the authority to keep a multinational army moving through uncertainty. Then came the Alps. The Alps were not simply a mountain range. They were an ordeal. Cold, altitude, narrow passes, treacherous paths, ambushes from local tribes, animals slipping from ledges, men breaking under exposure and exhaustion. All of it turned the crossing into something closer to a battle against nature itself. Snow and stone became enemies. Hunger became an enemy. Fear became an enemy. And still, the army moved. This is where Hannibal's greatness begins to reveal its deeper texture. It was not only that he had conceived the impossible route, it was that he could compel men to endure it. That requires more than charisma. It requires the ability to embody purpose so completely that others borrow strength from your certainty. At some point during that crossing, many must have doubted whether survival was still possible. Yet Hannibal kept the column alive, disciplined enough to continue, and focused enough to believe the suffering had meaning. When he finally emerged into Italy, his army was no longer untouched by the dream that had launched it. It was reduced, scarred, and bloodied by the mountain itself. But it was there. And for Rome, that fact alone was a shock of enormous magnitude. The war had not unfolded as expected. An enemy commander had not only ignored conventional logic, he had turned it inside out. Hannibal had arrived in Italy as a problem the Romans had not planned to solve. He moved quickly because he understood the value of momentum. He needed supplies, allies, and local support, especially among Gallic peoples hostile to Roman domination. But he also needed to demonstrate something more important, that Rome could be beaten in open conflict. The first clashes were therefore crucial. At the Ticinus, his cavalry proved its sharpness. At the Trebia, his battlefield intelligence became unmistakable. There, Hannibal exploited Roman impatience with ruthless precision. He drew them into battle under poor conditions, after forcing them into freezing water and engagement before they were properly prepared. He hid troops in ambush. He used cavalry superiority at the right moment. He made weather, terrain, and timing work as extensions of his will. The Roman army was badly mauled. This is the point at which Hannibal ceased to be merely a bold invader and became, in Roman eyes, something more dangerous. A commander who understood not only how to fight, but how to arrange the conditions under which the enemy would destroy itself. He could read temperament as clearly as topography. Roman aggression was not a barrier to him. It was raw material. That mattered because Rome's military confidence was built not only on manpower, but on habit. Roman commanders believed force and courage, properly applied, would usually prevail. Hannibal had already begun exposing the limitations of that belief. He had crossed mountains, thought impossible. He had defeated Roman forces on Italian soil. He had shown that imagination, when united with discipline, could wound even the most formidable republic. The Alps had not simply brought Hannibal into Italy. They had brought a new kind of war with him. After the Alps and the early victories, Rome might still have told itself that this invader would eventually be contained. Republics built on discipline and reserve can survive the first shock of disaster by believing disaster to be temporary. But Hannibal did not merely want to shock Rome. He wanted to expose its instincts, bait its pride, and turn its strengths against it. In 217 BC, at Lake Trasimene, he did exactly that. The Roman consul, Gaius Flaminius, pursued him with urgency, perhaps driven by anger, perhaps by the Roman need to restore honor through direct action. Hannibal understood the psychology of such men. He selected the battlefield carefully, or rather, he selected the killing ground. Lake on one side, hills on the other, mist in the morning air, narrow movement, limited visibility. He placed troops where they could remain concealed and allowed the Romans to march forward into a trap they did not yet know existed. Then the violence came all at once. From the front, from the flanks, from the heights. Roman units, unable to deploy coherently, were struck in confusion. Some were cut down where they stood. Others were driven towards the water. Command collapsed, formation dissolved. The consul himself was killed. What happened at Lake Trasimene was not simply a defeat. It was the destruction of a Roman army through design so exact that it still stands among the most devastating ambushes in military history. Rome was shaken. Fear spread, not because Roman armies had never lost before, but because this enemy seemed to understand how to unmake them in ways that felt almost intimate. He knew where pride would push them. He knew how haste could blind them. He knew how terrain, weather, and emotion could be woven together into one act of calculated ruin. In response, Rome did something rare and intelligent. It appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator. Fabius grasped what many others had failed to see. Hannibal was too dangerous to meet recklessly in open battle. So he adopted a strategy of attrition, shadowing, delaying, harassing, refusing decisive engagement. It was not glorious, but it was rational. It denied Hannibal the conditions in which he excelled. The Romans, however, were not a people naturally in love with caution. Delay looked like weakness. Patience looked like humiliation. Fabius was mocked as the delayer, as though understanding one's enemy too clearly were a kind of cowardice. But Fabius had seen the truth. Hannibal fed on Roman impatience. And Rome, being Rome, eventually gave him more of it. The result was Cannae. In 216 BC, Rome assembled one of the largest armies it had fielded up to that point. The intention was unmistakable. Overwhelm Hannibal, crush him with numbers, end the embarrassment, end the fear, end the war of maneuver by brute force. To Roman thinking, this must have felt like a restoration of normal order, massed infantry, aggressive advance, direct decision. To Hannibal, it was an opportunity. At Cannae, he produced a battle plan of astonishing elegance and deadly control. He positioned his center in a way that encouraged the Roman advance, allowing it to bend backwards as pressure increased. To the Romans, the enemy line appeared to be collapsing. They pushed harder, more men crowding into the center, tightening themselves into a dense wedge of confidence. This was precisely what Hannibal wanted. As the Romans pressed inward, his stronger infantry on the flanks pivoted in. At the same time, his cavalry defeated Roman horse and struck from the rear. Encirclement. Not chaos, not accident, design. The Roman army found itself enclosed on all sides, compressed into a suffocating mass where courage became useless and numbers became a trap. Men could scarcely wield weapons properly. There was no room to maneuver, no clear line of escape, no breathing space in which order might be restored. Then came the slaughter. Cannae was one of those moments when history seems almost too severe to be believed. Tens of thousands of Romans and allies died. Senators, officers, veterans, an entire political and military generation seemed to vanish in a single day. The scale of the defeat stunned the ancient world. And yet what gives Cannae its enduring power is not simply the body count. It is the quality of Hannibal's mind laid bare upon the field. He had taken the enemy's assumptions and weaponized them. He had let Roman force become Roman vulnerability. He had turned battlefield geometry into destruction of almost mathematical precision. Later generations would study Cannae with awe because it represents more than victory. It represents mastery of timing, of psychology, of structure, of disciplined deception. Hannibal did not merely beat Rome there. He revealed what warfare could become in the hands of a commander capable of seeing 3 moves beyond the obvious. And still, Rome did not die. That is the haunting brilliance and tragedy of Hannibal's life. His greatest victories were absolute on the battlefield, yet incomplete in strategic effect. He could shatter armies. He could terrify the Republic. He could make Rome feel mortal in a way no enemy had done before. But making a state feel mortal is not always enough to kill it. After Cannae, the obvious question hangs over the whole story like a shadow. Why was Rome still standing? If Hannibal had crossed the Alps, devastated Roman armies, annihilated one of the largest forces the Republic had ever assembled, and spread fear across Italy, why did he not end the war there? Why is his name attached not to the destruction of Rome, but to the terrible near miss of it? The answer lies in the harsh distinction between tactical genius and strategic finality. Hannibal was perhaps the finest battlefield commander of the ancient world. But battle, however decisive, is only one instrument in war. States are not slain solely by losing men in the field. They are broken when their systems collapse, their alliances, supplies, finances, morale, and political nerve. Rome, for all the horror it endured, still possessed reserves in all of these. Its manpower was astonishing. Its social and political structure, though often vicious and internally tense, could absorb losses that would have destroyed many kingdoms outright. Its allies did not abandon it in sufficient numbers. Some defected, yes, and Hannibal did win support in parts of southern Italy, but not enough to unravel the entire Roman Federation. That network of obligation and power, built over years of expansion, proved stronger than even Hannibal had hoped. There were practical constraints as well. Marching on Rome itself was not the same as taking it. Great field victories do not magically produce siege equipment, abundant reinforcements, secure logistics, or the means to storm a defended capital whose population and political class refuse surrender. Hannibal's army, brilliant and dangerous though it remained, was operating deep in enemy territory. Every campaign in Italy consumed strength he could not easily replace. And here we find one of the most painful truths in his career. Carthage did not always support him with the decisiveness his victories seemed to demand. The Carthaginian state had its own factions, priorities, and limitations. Resources had to be divided across multiple theaters. Political unity was imperfect. The result was that Hannibal often achieved extraordinary things without receiving the scale of reinforcement necessary to convert them into final strategic success. Rome, meanwhile, learned slowly, stubbornly, but unmistakably. It stopped feeding Hannibal the giant-pitched confrontations he wanted. Fabian caution, once ridiculed, became a guiding instinct. Roman commanders avoided direct disaster where possible, harried his movements, contained his opportunities, and focused on theaters beyond Italy, where the wider Carthaginian war effort could be weakened. The Roman response became less emotional and more structural. Spain was crucial. It had been the foundation of Hannibal's power base, a source of silver, troops, and strategic depth. If Rome could seize or disrupt that foundation, Hannibal's position in Italy would grow steadily more precarious. This is where Publius Cornelius Scipio began to change the war. He was not another blunt Roman aristocrat charging towards glory without understanding the enemy. He studied, he adapted, he grasped that Hannibal could not be defeated merely by matching his courage. He had to be outmaneuvered within the wider architecture of the war. As Roman fortunes improved in Spain, Hannibal's need for reinforcement grew more urgent. His brother Hasdrubal attempted to bring forces into Italy, a move that might have transformed the conflict by linking Carthaginian strength across theaters. But in 207 BC, at the Battle of the Metaurus, Hasdrubal was defeated and killed. His failure was more than a military setback. It was the collapse of one of Hannibal's last major chances to change the balance in Italy. The story of what followed is brutal enough to feel symbolic. Hasdrubal's severed head was reportedly thrown into Hannibal's camp. Whether one focuses on the act itself or not, the message was unmistakable. The strategic tide had turned. Hannibal, still dangerous, still respected, still feared, was no longer a man moving towards final victory. He was a commander, preserving a fading possibility. This is where his legend darkens into tragedy. He had done almost everything a general could do. He had crossed impossible terrain, inspired men through appalling hardship, outclassed Roman commanders, and achieved battlefield victories that would be studied for millennia. Yet war is an organism larger than command talent alone. It is sustained by institutions, by political coherence, by reinforcement, by endurance over time. Rome had these in greater abundance than Carthage could break. And so the war that Hannibal had illuminated with genius became the war he could no longer control. As Hannibal's campaign in Italy lost strategic momentum, Rome chose the course that would finally force the war to its conclusion. Instead of trying endlessly to destroy Hannibal on ground he had made lethal, Scipio carried the war into North Africa itself. It was a move of immense strategic clarity. If Hannibal could not be broken in Italy, then Carthage must be threatened so directly that it would have no choice but to call him home. That is exactly what happened. After more than a decade campaigning on Italian soil, years of movement, survival, brilliance, frustration, and fading possibility, Hannibal was recalled. It is one of the most poignant moments in ancient military history. The invader who had made Rome tremble, who had roamed through Italy as a specter of disciplined destruction, was forced to leave the theater that had made his name. He did not return in triumph. He returned because Carthage now needed saving. The final confrontation came at Zama in 202 BC. By then, the war had changed. Hannibal was still Hannibal, still formidable, still intellectually dangerous, still one of the finest military minds alive. But he no longer commanded the same army that had crossed the Alps and crushed Roman legions at Cannae. Years of attrition, differing troop quality, and strategic exhaustion had altered the balance. Scipio, meanwhile, had matured into the kind of Roman commander earlier generations had failed to produce: flexible, observant, and willing to learn from disaster rather than deny it. At Zama, the meeting was not simply between two generals, but between two phases of the war. Hannibal represented the terrible brilliance of Carthage's challenge. Scipio represented Rome's capacity to adapt, recover, and answer genius with disciplined evolution. Hannibal deployed elephants in hopes of disruption, but Scipio had prepared for that. Roman formations opened lanes, blunting the charge and reducing the shock effect. The infantry battle was hard fought, but cavalry once again proved decisive. This time, however, mounted superiority belonged not to Hannibal, but to Rome and its Numidian allies. Carthage lost. The Second Punic War ended, not with Rome shattered, but with Rome triumphant and transformed. The Republic had survived the most dangerous military challenge of its existence to that point. More than survived, in fact. It had emerged harder, more ruthless, and more convinced of its destiny. Hannibal had come closer than perhaps anyone else ever would to breaking it. But close, in history, is an unforgiving word. And yet, Hannibal's story does not end at Zama, because defeat did not reduce him to irrelevance. He remained active in Carthaginian politics, attempting reform and confronting corruption within the state. That too reveals something essential about him. He was not merely a battlefield creature, useful only in war. He understood systems, weakness, and power in all their forms. Rome certainly believed that. Even after victory, it never stopped watching him, never stopped fearing what he might yet inspire. Eventually, pressure from Rome forced him into exile. He passed through foreign courts in the eastern Mediterranean, advising rulers, planning campaigns, carrying with him the strange burden of a man too famous to be harmless. That is one of the most striking things about Hannibal's legacy. Even in defeat, even far from Italy, he remained an object of Roman unease. The empire to be had beaten him, yet it could not quite relax while he still lived. When the end came, Hannibal chose poison rather than capture. It was a final act entirely consistent with the life that preceded it. He would not be paraded. He would not be possessed by the enemy that had defined him. He met death as he had met war, on his own terms, defiant to the last. So how should we remember him? As one of the greatest generals in history, certainly. But that phrase, however deserved, is not enough. Hannibal matters because he embodies one of the most compelling truths in all of history, that brilliance can shake the world without mastering it completely. He forced Rome to confront fear, vulnerability, and mortality. He expanded the possibilities of warfare through audacity, deception, and supreme battlefield control. He lost the war, yes, but he lost it in such a way that his name outlived many victors. Rome conquered Carthage. Rome shaped the future. Rome claimed the official triumph. But Hannibal claimed something stranger, rarer, and in some ways greater. He claimed immortality in defeat. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more journeys into the lives of history's most extraordinary commanders, empires, and turning points. And in the comments, tell us this. Was Hannibal Barca the greatest general of the ancient world or the greatest commander in history never to win the final war?